Let's look at some examples of when a stick is really a kick-ass weapon. Hey folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. Now, as you may have noticed, there's been some back and forth between Shad and myself talking about good and bad weapons and sticks and batleths and various other things. This isn't really a continuation of that, but it does give me a springboard to talk about some examples of when sticks are really fantastic things. Now, in the past, I have done, admittedly, as Shad highlighted, videos where I express how sticks aren't very good weapons compared to things like, say, spears or swords or bows, although obviously a bow is a stick and a spear is a stick and a sword is a type of stick, maybe a sharpened stick, but you get the general gist. Generally speaking, more specialized and developed weapons developed because they're more effective than sticks, than a simple stick, than just one to hit someone with. But in addition, I've also done videos where I've talked about, particularly walking sticks in my case, how useful they are potentially in self-defense and how formidable they can be within certain circumstances. But what I don't think really done is extolled the virtues of the stick in a historical context, and we could say also a anthropological context as well. And I really want to, in this video, just highlight what I perceive and what I see as a few of the prime examples of when sticks are really fantastic. So the first one I want to highlight is when a stick is all you're basically allowed or able to gain access to. Now, let's just unpack that a tiny bit. First of all, there are lots of societies in the world where throughout history, not just in the modern world, but you can include the modern world, we can look all the way back into the ancient world, the known historical world, and potentially the prehistoric world, where people were either not allowed legally to carry a stick, or the stick was the only thing they had access to. So obviously if we go back into prehistory, there were rocks. If we go back into the Stone Age, for example, or if we go back to pre-Stone Age, then indeed sharpened sticks were super important and used predominantly as spears and javelins. Obviously thereafter also bows were invented, things like the boomerang were invented, the woomera, the club. All forms of stick, okay? So clearly in prehistory, sticks were super, super important. But even if we fast forward to the Bronze Age, the Iron Age, even the modern world, then there are examples of societies where people really weren't allowed either to own weapons or to carry weapons around. And as lots of people would point out, particularly American friends of mine, if you're not allowed to carry a weapon around, then it's basically doesn't exist in self-defense terms. So there certainly are situations, for example, in parts of medieval Europe, where you could not walk around a town or city with a sword, for example. You might be able to carry an eating knife, but you would be allowed to walk around with a fairly large stick. Now, partially for this reason, we do find developed martial arts systems from Europe and Asia and Africa and all over where the stick is focused on. Now, and in many of those societies, the battlefield weapon might be the spear, the bow, the sword, the mace, the axe. But within a civilian context, a stick of varying lengths, and it can be anything from a small truncheon or bastoncello, as the Renaissance Italians would call it, a small stick that you can carry around for self-defense, all the way up to a larger truncheon length, all the way up to a longer stick like a joe or a bow staff, and obviously quarterstaffs. I mean, you tend not to carry anything around that's really much above head height in a civilian environment, but certainly we see examples from medieval and Renaissance Europe and indeed Asia and Africa of sticks up to kind of head height being carried around as walking sticks. Now that's one of the great legal loopholes that no society really has managed to find a way around, is that ultimately you can disarm your population to the nth degree, but there are trees. If you live in a place with trees, then there's sticks and anybody can pick up a stick. So absolutely, I think it's very good to highlight the first most important situation of where sticks are absolutely freaking awesome is their force multipliers in a situation where you don't have any access to anything better, either for legal reasons or technological reasons. The next situation in which sticks are really cool weapons is if you need to equip a large group of people as quickly and cheaply as possible, or you could say equip them with things which are disposable and which don't cost you any money for whatever economic reasons. So for that reason, it's, spears, for example. People often point out on my channel, I'm often extolling the virtues of spears from a practical martial perspective, but quite rightly, a lot of people go, oh, well, spears are cheaper than swords. Now, usually people say that in the way of explaining why spears were more popular than swords, and I point out that no, actually, spears are more popular than swords because for most battlefield applications, they're more useful than swords. But it is nevertheless absolutely true to say that a spear is cheaper than a sword. It involves less metal, if it has metal at all. And remember, of course, that a spear can just be a sharpened point on the end, or you could use bone or horn or antler or stone, something readily and freely available, really. So yes, in a perfect world, you have a steel head or a bronze head. But if you don't have metal, then indeed you can top it with something else and you still have a functional spear. Against unarmoured people, even just an antler point on the end of here, or even just a sharpened point, is still going to work very effectively as a spear. Will still be able to overcome someone with a sword, for example. So yes, absolutely, sticks are cheap. Even as short weapons, as short sidearms, you can give them clubs. So if you wanted to equip, if you had 200 friends and you wanted to arm them as cheaply and quickly as possible, you buy a whole bunch, you buy 200 long poles and 200 short poles, and basically you put a point on the end of the long poles and use the short poles as striking implements, as clubs essentially. So that's another situation in which sticks are really kick-ass weapons. Yet another situation in which sticks are kick-ass weapons is in them being as bludgeoning instruments. Now, obviously, clubs go all the way back into prehistory. As early as we know, humans pretty much would have invented clubs straight away, I think, upon realising they could use a stick for anything at all. But even in the medieval period, even when armour was used, sometimes people chose cudgels. Now, in the past, I have separated a typical stick from a cudgel because I regard a cudgel as kind of a specialised stick. But at the end of the day, there are examples in art which do just seem to be large lumps of wood. Now, what I would say, just to balance this kind of favoritism towards the stick in this video, I would say that by and large, this is purely about momentum. It's about delivering a heavy lump to someone's armoured body, or sometimes unarmoured body. And a mace, you could say, is a more effective way of doing that, and it's more durable. It's more likely to focus the energy into a smaller area, and this kind of thing. So yes, admittedly, a mace with a metallic head is the natural evolution of the heavy cudgel or club. But if for some reason you don't have access to a mace, or your mace is broken, then a simple wooden club made out of the branch of a hardwood, preferably tree, is going to do the job. And quite simply, there are situations in which using a large heavy club in armour against other people in armour is going to be more effective than using some of the developed and specialised weapons that we might more often talk about on this channel. For example, if you've got a 1796 light cavalry sabre, yeah, it's got a point on it, but against someone in full plate armour with mail, voiders and everything else, it's not a useful weapon at all because you can't cut through the armour, it doesn't have much percussive force, and it doesn't have the type of point that you can get into the gaps in the armour or puncture mail with. So in that situation, a large heavy club, 5 foot, 6 foot long with a heavy bulbous end, is literally, it's going to cost you nothing because it comes straight off a tree, and it literally might be a more effective weapon than something like a 1796 light cavalry sabre. So again, it comes back to context and the fact that sometimes a big stick can be a better weapon than something which has taken hundreds of years to develop. Now, the next situation in which sticks are freaking awesome is in law enforcement, or should we call it non-lethal force. Okay, so when we talk about weapons, especially on this channel, I have to accept, hands up, I'm guilty of this. We often focus on lethal weapons because we focus on warfare and dueling and things like this. But actually, statistically, throughout history, an awful lot of weapons have been used for non-lethal force. And this is one of the things that I've always tried to impress upon people about the importance of the bayonet, because a lot of when I talk about how important bayonets are and the fact that they were still being issued, they're still being issued today, in fact, in a lot of armies, certainly in the British Army still. And a lot of people go, oh, but Matt, you know, in World War I or World War II, not a lot of people were killed with bayonets. True, but that's not what bayonets are primarily there to do. Bayonets are there to enable you to take ground, hold ground, drive people away. Sometimes they might be used in peacekeeping and holding off potential rioters or people who aren't very well armed from, you know, sort of surging over you and this kind of stuff. And there are situations where you're literally not allowed to shoot at people for obvious ethical and legal reasons. So bayonets have a purpose, but equally sticks have a purpose, and this goes all the way throughout history, where you want a object that is non-lethal, and this will relate to my next point as well, which I've compartmentalized into a whole separate topic. But quite simply, to keep it brief, if you want to hit people and subdue them, but you don't want to wound them or kill them or end up with casualties, sticks are a pretty good way to go. And even today, we see sticks of various different lengths and types, all the way up to 6-foot sticks, but obviously truncheons, side handle batons, things like this. Indeed, nunchucks. I'm not going to talk specifically about nunchucks here, but you will see weapons that have been used for non-lethal purposes essentially boil down to being a stick. Now, the final use of a stick, which I think is massively important and gets hugely overlooked, actually, even within the modern HEMA movement, and it does boil down to the fact that it's usually a non-lethal, unless you try really, really hard, it's generally speaking a non-lethal object, is as a training device. That's right. So if your primary goal is to learn to use a spear in warfare or even in single combat, then what do you practice with? A stick. If your goal is to, obviously we could talk about bows here, but we won't. I kind of don't like equating the stick with a bow, because a bow is obviously a piece of technology that requires on a certain type of stick and a bowstring and arrows and so on and so forth. So talking mainly about striking weapons, hand weapons. If you want to practice swordsmanship, the fundamental weapon of choice is a stick. Okay, throughout history. So even in the era when, you know, Federschwert or blunt practice swords, steel training swords existed, they still used sticks. Sticks were still an incredibly important practice weapon for the sword. The single stick was still being used into the 20th century and was still used alongside the foil and the épée as a practice weapon for sabre, because it's cheap, it's relatively disposable, it doesn't cause huge injury, so therefore it's relatively safe. All of these sorts of advantages. And if we go back into history, indeed, we find in the 17th century, again in the era of the rapier, we find things like the dussac, the practice quarterstaff, we find wooden swords, even wooden rapiers, believe it or not. So not all practice rapiers were made of steel, they did have practice rapiers made of wood. And if we go back into the Middle Ages, indeed lots and lots of practice swords were wooden. We find reference also to baleen, that's whale cartilage used for sticks, essentially a stick made out of baleen instead of wood, but they were used in tournaments. We find reference to wooden weapons used in fencing schools and also in tournaments, and just general training, swordsmanship training. So if you don't have access to a specialised steel training sword, and bear in mind, even if you do, that's going to be a more dangerous object to use, you still have access to sticks. So sticks in the Middle Ages were the de facto go-to practice weapon for swords. Equally, if we go back into the ancient world, well, we know the Romans also trained their gladiators with sticks, okay? Whether it's for spears or whether it's for swords, they had wooden sword analogues, okay? We go back into the Bronze Age, for example. We have found from the Bronze Age wooden swords as well. Again, so as a practice weapon, incredibly important, and really I suspect that the vast majority of practiced swordsmen or spearmen and people using daggers as well, also used for knife simulators. We know that wooden rondel daggers were used in the Middle Ages, for example. They're shown in Joachim Mayer's treatise from 1570, so it's Renaissance, but we know they were used in the medieval period as well. So for any type of hand weapon, really a stick is going to be the practice weapon. And as I say, throughout history, the majority of people who trained to use weapons probably started out their training with sticks, and the stick therefore was their most important go-to training weapon. So I hope this has been thought-provoking. If you can think of other reasons, situations, scenarios, particular contexts where a stick is a better weapon than something which is more developed and evolved and technologically advanced, then post below. I'm really fascinated to hear. And one thing I'd just throw in as a kind of in a parting thought as well is, in the age of firearms, when you've fired your musket, if you didn't have a bayonet, for example in the Americas they weren't particularly keen on bayonets, they used to turn the musket around the other way, and it was called clubbing your musket, using it as a club. And at that point, the fact that you've got a metal, an iron barrel and firelock attached to your musket becomes kind of irrelevant, because really you're just hitting someone with a big club. You're hitting someone with a wooden butt, so to speak. So even in the age of firearms, clubs have still been hugely important, both as lethal weapons and as non-lethal weapons. And really, I think one of the main takeaways I'd like people to take away from this video is, regardless of the effectiveness of different types of stick in actual martial kind of battlefield or combat situations or law enforcement situations, we must never underestimate how throughout history, by every culture in the world that I've ever looked at, whether it's Zulus and Maasai in Africa, whether it's Native Americans in North America or indeed in South America, whether it's in Asia, whether it's in Europe, the simple stick of varying sizes and shapes has been the predominant training weapon for learning how to fight in hand-to-hand combat. Hope this has been entertaining. I hope I see you back on the channel again soon. Cheers for watching, folks, and cheers for sticking with me. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.